Her fingertips trembled against the worn fabric of her coat as she stood on the curb, waiting for the bus that would carry her across the city. Grace pulled the garment tighter around herself, trying to shake off the early morning chill that settled into her bones. It wasn't just the cold causing her to shiver. Anxiety gnawed at her from the inside out. Today she was heading to an interview for a position that had appeared in her life with the unsettling suddenness of a lightning strike. Less than a week ago she had lost her job at the local care facility, a place she had come to depend upon for steady hours, health benefits, and a modest but vital paycheck. As a single mother, every cent had mattered. Every grueling shift, every double she had worked through the night had been to keep her small family afloat. Now, with the facility's closure, she was adrift. The small amount in her checking account would cover the rent for maybe another month, and after that, she and her daughter had no safety net. At 29, Grace felt decades older. She carried on her shoulders the weight of her 8-year-old daughter's future. Addie, bright-eyed and relentlessly curious, whose trust in her mother was an unwavering source of both pride and guilt. When Grace had come home after her last shift, she hadn't known how to explain that her job was gone. Addie had just looked up at her with wide, concerned eyes. The little girl noticed every detail, the slump of her mother's shoulders, the forced cheer in her voice. But Addie's biggest concern was never how they would get by. It was only how her mother was feeling. That was the heartbreak of it. Grace knew she couldn't crumble under the pressure, even though she felt cracks forming in every direction. As the bus approached, hissing to a stop, Grace boarded with her meager handful of coins. She grabbed a seat near the back, ignoring the stale odor and the flickering fluorescent overhead light. The route took her past the outskirts of the city and into a part of town where she had never ventured. The addresses on these streets escalated in grandeur, culminating in tall wrought-iron gates and sprawling mansions. It felt surreal, as though she'd stumbled into a neighborhood she might only see in a movie about old money and secret aristocracies. Clutched in her hand was a flyer she had found pinned to a bulletin board at the public library. An unusual job posting titled, "Caregiver needed for immobile individual. Discretion and dedication required. Generous compensation." At first, she had doubted it was legitimate. It read more like something from a story than a normal employment advertisement. Still, she was in no position to be choosy. In the days that followed, she had left countless voicemails and filled out applications at every nursing home, clinic and hospital in the area to no avail. Whatever possessed her to call the number on that flyer, she couldn't say. But the calm, polished voice on the other end had explained that a gentleman needed round-the-clock help: bathing, feeding, medication administration, and companionship. The caretaker would live on site, with a schedule that allowed occasional days off. "Do you have experience working with adults who require total assistance?" the voice had asked. She had answered as honestly as she could, explaining her background as a certified nursing aide. The voice informed her she would have to be evaluated in person for them to see if she had the right disposition and skill set. This was not a job for someone who couldn't handle both physical demands and emotional complexities. Grace understood that all too well. Caring for the elderly or the disabled wasn't just a matter of tasks. It required empathy and patience. She had plenty of that to give. The bus lurched forward once more, rolling through imposing brick pillars that flanked the entrance of a neighborhood which seemed designed for seclusion rather than warmth. Tall hedges and old oaks lined the curving drive. She stared, open-mouthed, at the flawless lawns and immaculate gardens. It almost felt as though this portion of the city existed in another world entirely, a place where wealth promised refuge from the mundane, ordinary struggles people like her faced day in and day out. When the driver called her stop, Grace stepped down onto a sidewalk that glimmered with morning dew. She double-checked the GPS on her phone. The address was only a few minutes' walk away. Rolling her shoulders back, trying to steady her breathing, she walked past 2 more gated properties before arriving at a massive gate adorned with an elegant crest. She pressed the intercom button by the wrought iron bars. A low hiss emanated from the speaker, followed by a clipped, polite female voice. "Yes?" Grace cleared her throat, suddenly embarrassed by how shaky her voice sounded. "I'm here about the caretaker position. My name is Grace McAllister." A pause, then a mechanical whir as the gate slid open. Inside, the driveway curved around a small orchard, eventually revealing a massive house. It rose up like a relic of another era, with towering windows and ivy trailing the walls. She couldn't help but feel a flutter of intimidation. She had only ever seen estates like this in photographs. At the front door, she was greeted by an older woman dressed in a crisp blouse and skirt, her hair pinned back in a neat twist. Her gaze flicked over Grace's discount store coat, scuffed shoes, and the weariness etched into her features. But she said nothing. Instead, she introduced herself as Mrs. Haynes, the house manager, and instructed Grace to follow her down a long corridor. The inside of the mansion was somehow even more intimidating. Gleaming marble floors, framed paintings that likely cost more than Grace's entire lifetime of rent, and a quiet that felt unnatural for a home. She almost missed the hum of everyday family noise, the battered carpets, the cozy messes that had once adorned her grandmother's living room. Mrs. Haynes led her to a stately library where rows upon rows of books formed a labyrinth around plush leather chairs. "Please wait here," the older woman said. "He'll be in shortly." Grace swallowed, once again glancing around. How many visitors had been overwhelmed by this setting? There was a sense of hushed grandeur, as though generations of secrets were housed within these walls. She could practically feel them hovering in the shadows. She heard the faint hum of machinery before she saw the wheelchair. A tall, lean man with pronounced cheekbones and piercing green eyes glided into the library, controlling his motorized chair with a small joystick. He wore a fitted navy sweater and black trousers. Something about him exuded a stark seriousness, as though he'd long ago let go of any frivolity in life. Every line of his face suggested a man who'd once lived a different kind of existence. One of confidence, independence, maybe even adventure, and now faced a deeply altered reality. "So you're the new candidate?" he asked, voice low and unwavering. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her tone polite. "Grace McAllister." He nodded, eyes flicking to Mrs. Haynes, who retreated without a word, leaving the two of them alone in the silent library. Grace could feel the heavy stare of the man in the wheelchair, as though he were trying to read every hidden page of her life simply by gazing at her. "My name is James Montgomery," he said, enunciating clearly. "I'm 37 years old. The accident that left me partially paralyzed happened 3 years ago. Since then, I've gone through more caregivers than I'd like to admit. Most either give up within the first few months or simply can't handle the demands. I'll be frank, I have a temperament that isn't always easy." Grace nodded, absorbing the hint of warning in his words. She thought of Addie at home, alone with her books and stuffed animals, so trusting that her mom would make things work. She thought of the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the meltdown she'd almost had in her car the previous day, panic clawing at her throat when she realized she had no plan B if she failed to find work. "I understand," Grace responded softly, meeting his gaze. "I have years of experience caring for seniors and people with disabilities, but I won't pretend to know your exact needs or your personality from a single conversation. All I can say is I'm ready to try, if you'll give me the chance." James's lips twitched, though he didn't quite smile. Fine. I'll give you a chance. Mrs. Haynes will show you around. We'll see if you last longer than the others." With that, he turned his chair and headed toward the corridor. Mrs. Haynes reappeared, gesturing for Grace to follow. She was led upstairs to a small but comfortable suite. A modest bedroom, an attached bathroom, and a tiny sitting area. The windows overlooked a portion of the orchard. "This will be yours if you accept the position," Mrs. Haynes announced. "You'll be on call whenever he needs something, day or night. Normally we have a small staff for the property's maintenance, but only Mr. Montgomery's personal caretaker lives on site. Your schedule will be demanding. There are tasks every morning at 6, including medication and helping him with personal care. Then you'll accompany him throughout the day. Physical therapy occurs twice a week, and you'll assist with that." Grace listened intently, carefully filing away each detail. The routine sounded daunting, but not impossible. If the salary truly matched what she'd been told over the phone, it would be a godsend. Enough to pay down her existing debts and keep Addie fed and clothed without perpetual fear. The thought alone lifted a fraction of the weight she'd been carrying. At the same time, she worried about leaving Addie with a neighbor for too many overnights. She'd have to figure out a plan. By the evening, James had officially hired her, though he did so in a lukewarm tone, reminding her that he expected competence and loyalty. That first night, Grace had dinner by herself in a small staff dining area. The rest of the household staff seemed polite but distant, as though they were used to the caretaker of the moment and had learned not to invest too much in a newcomer. She could sense their unspoken bet on how many days or weeks she would last. It was well past dusk when she finally retreated to her new room and sank onto the bed. The day had been so surreal that she half expected to wake up and find it was all a dream. She picked up her phone and noticed 3 missed calls from Addie's babysitter. Panicking, she dialed back. Thankfully, it was only Addie wanting to say goodnight and hear her mom's voice. Grace exhaled, calming her thudding heart. She reassured her daughter that everything was fine and that she'd be back home in the morning to sort out some arrangements. After she hung up, Grace stared at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, flickers of light from the orchard's security lamps. She wished she could bring Addie here, let her see the orchard and those beautiful grounds. But she had no idea how James would react to a child's presence. The job hadn't specified anything about family, and she wasn't sure whether it was appropriate to ask. For now, she'd keep that separate. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, an army of worries marched through her mind. This job might be her lifeline, but it could also be a trap if James's temper was as difficult as he hinted. She worried about the other reasons so many caregivers had quit. Were they paid well, but treated poorly? Did something happen in the shadows of this house that no one dared talk about? By 5 in the morning, she gave up on trying to sleep. She showered and dressed in casual but professional clothing, determined to make a solid impression on her first full day. She kept her hair tied back and applied a minimal amount of makeup, hoping to appear collected, even if her insides were quivering with apprehension. Mr. Montgomery was already up when she tapped lightly on the door to his suite. It was a massive room, larger than the entire apartment Grace shared with Addie. He sat by the open window, a thick blanket over his legs, the motorized wheelchair beside him. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, sending amber rays across the orchard. For a moment, the light highlighted the angles of his face, giving him a quiet, austere beauty that contrasted sharply with the tension in his expression. "You're early," he noted, glancing at the clock. "I thought I might as well get used to the schedule," she replied politely. He only nodded. For the next half hour, she helped him with his morning routine, administering pills, checking for any bed sores or areas of redness that might signal skin issues, and assisting him into his chair. Grace worked methodically, focusing on maintaining his dignity at all times. She was aware of his watchful gaze, evaluating her every move. He hardly spoke throughout the entire process, except to issue short instructions. When she finished, he cleared his throat. "I have physical therapy today. We leave in an hour." She glanced at him, wanting to ask how he managed the logistics. Did he have a specially equipped vehicle? A driver? But she bit back the question, figuring it was best to observe for now and learn. She followed him out of the room, a quiet figure behind his wheelchair, as he navigated a ramp that led to an elevator. Downstairs, Mrs. Haynes was waiting, a large black SUV parked in the circular drive. The driver, a man in a neat grey suit, stepped out to help, lowering a specialized lift from the rear of the vehicle. It all felt strangely clandestine, moving in a hush from the mansion to the SUV and heading into the city. Physical therapy took place in a high-end rehabilitation center with shining floors and advanced equipment that seemed light years ahead of the small clinic where Grace had previously worked. She watched as the therapist guided James through a series of exercises, none of which he appeared enthusiastic about. The man's expression remained a stoic mask, but Grace sensed his resentment simmering just beneath the surface. During a break, the therapist came over to introduce herself to Grace, her manner friendly. "Hi, I'm Fiona. You must be James's new caregiver. Is he giving you a hard time yet?" Her eyes twinkled with a mix of warmth and mischief. Grace offered a faint smile, glancing at James, who was pointedly looking away. "Not yet," she said softly. "He can be a tough one," Fiona murmured, leaning in slightly. "But he's been through a lot. You'll find your own way to connect with him." Grace nodded, reflecting on how to build trust with someone who clearly resisted it. She busied herself writing down the recommended exercises she'd need to help him with at the mansion, mindful of the posture he should maintain and the movements that would prevent his muscles from further atrophy. When they returned to the estate, James said nothing until they reached the wide foyer. "Bring me to the library," he said abruptly. "Then make sure lunch is prepared in an hour." She obeyed, guiding his wheelchair along the polished floors. Once he was settled in the library, she went to the kitchen to speak with the house's part-time cook, an older man named Tobias. He explained that he handled meal planning for James, but everything else, feeding, plating, or special diets, would be part of her duties. Grace realized her role here would be far more comprehensive than she had initially assumed. Over the next few days, she fell into a rhythm of sorts. Mornings started early with James's personal care, followed by breakfast, occasionally more therapy or appointments, and then afternoons in his study, where he read documents related to what remained of his business affairs. Evenings brought quiet dinners in the dining room, although James often ate alone. Grace would remain on standby until he was ready for bed. Sometimes the isolation weighed on her, but she consoled herself by calling Addie whenever she could, hearing her daughter's cheerful voice. The staff continued to be polite but distant, as though they'd watched this cycle repeat too many times. Caregivers arrived, hopeful yet overwhelmed. Eventually, they disappeared in tears or anger. One day, Grace bumped into a younger maid, Lucy, who whispered conspiratorially, "He's not a bad person, you know. Mr. Montgomery he has scars no one sees. He tries to keep them hidden, but they come out in his temper." Grace thanked Lucy for her kindness, storing that observation away. It was the same impression she'd gotten. Behind James's icy exterior, a storm of hurt raged. One rainy afternoon, James had an outburst over something trivial. He was annoyed that his wheelchair had been positioned a few inches to the right of where he preferred it. He snapped at Grace, telling her it was incompetent to miss such a detail. The words stung more than she cared to admit. She took a careful breath, calming the spike of defensiveness that rose in her. She knew this wasn't about the chair. It was about his sense of powerlessness. "I'm sorry," she managed, keeping her voice measured. "I'll do better next time." He glowered, turning his gaze to the rain-soaked window. "Don't apologize unless you plan to fix your mistakes. It's pointless otherwise." Frustration gnawed at her, but she held it in. "Understood, Mr. Montgomery." With that, she left him alone in the sitting room, giving him space to brood. She headed upstairs to the suite she'd been given, taking a moment to collect herself. The day was cold and damp, the sky a monotone grey that matched her mood. She looked at her phone, longing to text Addie, but realized it was still school hours. For a second, she questioned her decision to stay here in this enormous, lonely estate. But then she reminded herself of the paycheck, the chance to build a future for her daughter. She changed into a sweater and freshened up before returning downstairs to offer James some tea or a warmer blanket. When she found him, he was still staring out at the rain, shoulders tense. The quiet in the room felt vast. "There's tea ready if you'd like, sir," Grace offered, stepping into his line of sight. He frowned but finally nodded. She moved to prepare a cup, determined to show that she could handle his moods with calm professionalism. As she brought it to him, his gaze lingered on her face as though trying to read something there. "You're not afraid to stand up to me, are you?" he asked abruptly. She blinked. Why do you ask?" His voice was quieter now. "Because I can tell you're holding back. Most people either cower or run the moment they sense any real anger from me." Grace set the tea down. "I don't see the point in yelling back. That doesn't accomplish much. But I won't run unless I have a better reason to do so." An odd flicker of admiration crossed his features, vanishing as quickly as it came. He turned the motor on his wheelchair, maneuvering himself closer to the table so he could pick up the mug. After a moment, he said, "Your calm might serve you well here, or it might break you. We'll see." The days slipped into a cautious routine, each morning a test of her patience and skill, each night a test of her endurance. James's mood swings swung like a pendulum. There were moments he was so cold, it felt like he was using cruelty to keep everyone at arm's length. Other times, especially after a physically taxing therapy session, a hint of vulnerability showed through. In those intervals, Grace glimpsed what might have been the man he used to be before the accident. Empathetic, perhaps even kind. She discovered small details about him. He once loved to travel. He had a motorcycle that now sat idle in a distant garage, a silent reminder of his former freedoms. He used to be engaged, though no one said what happened to that relationship. She guessed the strain of his paralysis might have driven her away. Or maybe it was something else. She didn't pry. Meanwhile, Grace was fighting her own battles. The cost of Addie's after-school care and the bills piling up at her apartment were a constant source of worry. She was grateful for the paycheck from Mr. Montgomery, but it wasn't immediate, and some expenses couldn't wait. On her off days, she'd hurry home to be with Addie, tucking her into bed and sleeping in their old apartment. But then she'd have to come right back early the following morning. It was an exhausting back and forth. Yet whenever doubt crept in, she reminded herself that this was better than the terror of having no income at all. One evening, after a particularly rough round of therapy that left James pale and drenched in sweat, he refused dinner. She found him in the library, head in his hands, as though trying to hold in the last of his resolve. Grace approached quietly, unsure if he'd lash out or remain silent. Do you need anything?" she ventured softly. He looked up, eyes gleaming with tears he refused to shed. "I need a new body," he answered bitterly. She winced at the raw agony in his tone. "I wish I could help you with that," she murmured. He exhaled sharply as though frustrated with her empathy. But then he forced himself to speak more calmly. There's a phone call I need to make, but never mind. Would you like me to dial the number for you? She offered gently. He hesitated. It's to a friend. Well, a former friend. I haven't spoken to him since the accident. He's invited me to visit him at least a dozen times, but I can't stand the thought of him seeing me this way. I feel so less than. Grace felt her throat tighten. Maybe it would help to talk to him. Sometimes the people who knew us before can remind us that we're more than our circumstances. James met her eyes searching. You think so? Yes, she said, pressing the phone gently into his hand. The hardest part is believing you still matter to them. But the people who truly care, it doesn't fade just because life changed. He stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it aside. I can't do it yet, he confessed in a whisper. That's okay, Grace said, her heart aching for him. Another time. A silence settled, punctuated by the sound of rain tapping against the window. Eventually, James cleared his throat. I'm sorry about snapping at you earlier, he said, voice gruff. You didn't deserve that. Grace's eyes widened a bit, not expecting an apology. It's all right. No, it's not, he insisted, though he seemed uncomfortable expressing contrition. But I appreciate you sticking around. She offered a small smile. I'm here as long as you need me. In that moment, she felt a subtle shift. It wasn't a grand transformation. James remained prickly, private, burdened by unresolved anger. But something in his demeanor suggested that a fragile door had cracked open, allowing a first glimpse of trust. Grace kept her promise to stay. That night, after he finally agreed to go to bed, she lingered by his door for a few seconds, listening to the reassuring hum of his breathing machine. Then she made her way back to her own suite, mind spinning with the events of the day. She realized she was growing protective of him, even though he frustrated and often hurt her feelings. Beneath his jagged edges lay a sorrow that resonated with her own anxieties about not being enough, for her daughter, for her own future. She called Addie once more to say goodnight, smiling through tears when she heard her daughter's cheerful chatter about a science project due at school. Just hearing that excitement reminded Grace why she was fighting so hard. She was determined to turn this uncertain job into a stable opportunity for her family. She had no idea just how many obstacles still lay ahead.